You heard it right here, right down from the beach.
The new ivory is mammoth.
What do you guys want to know? I've done way too much research on dinosaurs.
Almost a larger-than-life figure.
No reason at all to think it was made by aliens.
Drop down and go swimming as fast as you can. Out of whale.
All these big giants give me a kiss and tell me they don't.
The crowd, just the pot, the loudness, the excitement, the electricity. I don't know if I can take your little Canadian destroyer.
Future is scary, but it's also wonderful.
So today's episode is kind of a big deal. Like someone who has a chapter named after them in your economics textbooks, kind of big. The kind of guest who can explain inflation, recession, and your student debt, all while sipping coffee calmly like it's no biggie. So if you ever fell asleep in an Econ 101 lecture but still managed to pass, you probably owe that pass to this guy. He's shaped the way half of the world understands economics and somehow made graphs cooler than they have any right to be. So today he's here with us on Unscriptify yet. And he's here all by his own choice. And no lesson plans, no syllabus, just vibes, big ideas, and a few laughs with Professor Gregory Mankiw. Professor Mankiw, thank you for being with us. And should we get into it?
Thank you. It's great to be with you.
Thank you. Let's start with a simple question. Would Einstein think of economics as science? What do you think?
I think he would. There's a famous quote from Einstein's that I like using in things I write. He said something to the effect of, "Science is nothing more than the refinement of everyday thinking," and that is sort of what economics is. It tries to apply the scientific method, that is the tools of logic and data analysis and inference, to questions about how the economy works. We try to put aside value judgments. We try to put aside ideology and try to attack these economic questions with the impartial attitude of a scientist.
So you yourself taught thousands of students written the go-to textbooks, and you shape how economics is introduced to these young new generations and generations. So what did you choose to write the principle of economics like the textbook the way you did, or to be accessible, to be a little bit humorous, not too academic sounding? And was that intentional from day one or something?
Well, it was intentional. My personal background is that I got interested in economics because I was interested in questions about the world. My background, I started off actually as a math major in college, and then when I realized I wasn't as good at math as I thought I was, I switched to economics, which uses math, but not heavy-duty math. But I always had a big interest in public policy. And indeed, when I was like a student at Princeton University as an undergraduate, I wrote for the student newspaper. And so my writing tends to be on the less technical, more informal side. And I think that style of writing naturally worked well on writing an economics textbook. I wasn't consciously thinking, I need to make this more conversational, more magazine-like than my competitors. But just the way I write, that naturally came across that way.
Yeah, but trust me, whatever, and especially in economics, whatever science you study, if you see a bunch of graphs at your pages when you open them, it's almost immediately uncomfortable feeling.
Yeah, well, but the math that I use in my introductory economics textbook is really math that everyone has learned in high school. They may have forgot it. They may not be used to applying it to non-mathematical questions like economics, but the math is really not that intimidating. And so what I try to do is really use math that most people learn by 10th, 11th grade, and basically explain basic economic concepts. I mean, interestingly, that the use of math in economics is relatively recent. If you go back to the 19th century and you look at the textbooks at the time, they're all words. Now, that might seem like that must be much easier, but in fact, they're much harder to understand because sometimes it's hard to say things precisely with words, where you can say things more precisely with a graph. And so I think that the combination of fairly simple math and a fairly conversational writing style, I think, makes the book accessible for most people.
Yeah.
Yeah, but also with principles, being simple, being for these kind of new students and everything. Do you think there is a principle among 10 of them that still gets consistently misunderstood or misused either by professors or by students? What do you think?
Oh, which gets misunderstood. Well, and the book starts off with microeconomics and then goes on to macroeconomics. And it's micro is a study of particular individuals, study of particular markets, and macro is the study of forces that affect the economy as a whole. Macro is intrinsically more controversial among economists, and therefore I think it is probably one that generates most disagreement about how to teach it and how to approach it. So I think that I start off the book with 10 principles of economics, and the last 3 are macro.
Mhm.
And I think those are probably the most controversial. I think micro is there's more a consensus among economists, so it's clearer what to teach. Oh, I should say even some of the micro things that economists agree on don't necessarily get agreement among the general public. I mean, right now, we're seeing Donald Trump pursuing a very anti-free trade agenda as president of the United States. He's putting tariffs on a lot of our trading partners. That's very inconsistent with the basic microeconomics of trade that I've been teaching through my textbook long before Donald Trump entered the political scene. So, even the things that are not controversial among economists are often controversial among the general public, and therefore are kind of eye-opening when the typical student reads about them in the textbook.
Yeah, and that must be frustrating because we know how hard it is to get economists to agree, and then when they do agree, now the public doesn't.
No, there's some policies that that economists are very much agreement on. One is where we tend to be in favor of open global trading system. In terms of policy interventions, we tend to in favor of things like our carbon tax to deal with global climate change, even though that's not particularly popular in some political circles. So there's certain things that economists agree on. Now, there's a lot of things we don't agree on, and then my job as a textbook author is to explain the nature of the disagreement, and so the students can decide which side of the line they agree with. And then some things are intrinsically difficult, like, how much should the government redistribute income? That's a deep question that involves some economics and some political philosophy. And not surprisingly, there's going to be have different value judgments and come to different conclusions about that. So my job is to explain agreement when there is agreement, explain disagreement when there's disagreement, and let the student ultimately make the call themselves.
Yeah, but I don't want to jump straight away into real world policy, but since you mentioned Trump, do you know one of the things that when it came to trade talks that I found actually interesting, people didn't mention, when he put the tariffs on European Union and China, the political move is we respond with equal measures, right? But would you agree, right, that even if you quote unquote didn't put that political revenge on it, if you could still get the products from the United States without tariffs, that's still good for your country, right? Even though you cannot do business with them in this way, right?
Yeah, no, I think the best solution for everybody is no tariffs anywhere.
Yeah, absolutely.
When I say puts on tariffs, what I think about is if we shoot ourselves in the foot, should you shoot yourself in the foot? And so no, so I think not retaliating is better than retaliating. But I think the only argument for retaliating is hoping it is a bargaining chip. And indeed, Trump at sometimes talks about how he likes tariffs. Other times he talks about how it's a bargaining position, so he can reduce tariffs everywhere. He's very inconsistent. I mean, one of the things that particularly gets confused now is the idea of a trade deficit. A trade deficit is basically when we import more than we export. We have a trade deficit.
And Trump believes that's like losing money from your pocket.
Yeah, exactly. Trump thinks it's like losing money, and that's not how economists think about it. One of my favorite quotes I use in one of my textbooks is from Robert Solow, who says, "I run a chronic deficit with my barber. He never buys anything from me." Right? That doesn't mean you're not getting anything from your barber. You're getting a haircut. But even though you're running a trade deficit with your barber. Similarly, we shouldn't think of the trade deficit as we're losing. No, we're getting something. We're getting the goods, they're getting the money. So the trade deficit is not necessarily a sign that we're losing in that transaction. If we're worried about trade deficits, and there are arguments that we should, it's not primarily about trade restrictions. It's really having to do with spending versus production. And the United States tends to be a low-saving economy, which is why a lot of capital is flowing here and we're running trade deficits. So if we really want to reduce those trade deficits, we need to increase national saving to match the levels of national saving in the rest of the world. And that's not what the Trump administration or really any policymaker is focused on right now. So I think there's a basic misunderstanding about trade deficits. And that's the part of macroeconomics that I think has a general agreement among economists, but has really no understanding in the general public at all.
Yeah, and there is also, I think, some of his moves, like the whole NATO spending with 5%, or stuff like he required through the new trade deal in Europe for Europe to purchase a certain things from the United States at this price. People are saying that those are successful, trading, agreements, but in a sense, since he is the president of the most powerful country on earth, he has a big bargaining chip, and some of those tactics he can push much more easily on countries like even smaller power, even though European Union is small. It's certainly.
I generally
like the United
disagree with
States.
Trump. I generally disagree with Trump for exactly the reason you said, which is he's acting a little bit like a bully. He says, "Well, I'm the president of the biggest country around, so therefore I can bully other countries into doing what I want." And I think that's basically not a good way to treat friends, allies. So I don't really like his general approach to international relations. Having said that, there's a couple of things I kind of agree with him on a relationship vis-a-vis European countries. One is we have tended to spend more on national defense than a lot of European countries, and European countries sort of benefited from that. So this idea of bringing countries to parity, the NATO countries to parity, so everybody's spending more on defense is probably a good thing. So I don't like the tactics he's using to get there, but that's not an unreasonable goal to try to get Europe to spend more on their own defense. And I think the Ukraine-Russia war has really highlighted that as well. Not only Trump's bullying tactics. The second thing I agree with him on is on this issue of pharmaceutical prices. Trump correctly points out that a lot of pharmaceuticals are priced much lower in Europe than they are in the United States, and that's because a lot of European countries have price controls, and therefore they won't let the pharmaceuticals in unless they agree to be subject to these price controls. Essentially, what that means is that Europe is free riding on the research that is being paid by American consumers. American consumers are paying the high price and subsidizing the research, and so then the Europeans are benefiting from the research, but not really helping pay for it. So Trump wants basically the pharmaceutical companies to charge more in these European countries and less in the United States. That's not a bad goal, actually, in my view. I don't like the way he's achieving it. I'd rather have him do it through international organizations like the WTO. But he's right that there's a fundamental unfairness that Europeans impose price controls, whereas the United States pays higher prices and has to fund a disproportionate amount of the fundamental research that creates these pharmaceuticals.
Yeah. Do you also, maybe jumping from topic to topic, but do you see, since you mentioned, for example, carbon tax, and you believe that's a good thing to pursue, there's been, as you said, especially from the right wing as well in Europe, there's not been much enthusiasm about the carbon tax. Do you see that as an effective way economics can help, truly combat climate change? Is that something you think is first 101 in fighting from economic side on the climate change thing?
No, I do. I do. I mean, if you think of how a typical person's life and how their life choices affect their carbon footprint, you realize there's all sorts of things. There's a question of what kind of a car do I buy? There's a question of how close I live to work. It's a question of whether I drive my car or take public transportation. There's a question of whether I live in a big house or which is fairly energy inefficient, or a relatively smaller apartment, because apartment buildings tend to be more energy efficient. So there's all sorts of lifestyle choices that affect my carbon footprint. There's no way we can easily by direct control tell people every decision they need to make. And in a free society, we really don't want to even try to do that. But what a carbon tax does is it puts a price on any decision that you make. It's going to expand your carbon footprint, and therefore it gives you a nudge to move in the direction of a smaller carbon footprint. So I think there's a really a very compelling economic case to put a price on carbon. And in some ways, Europe has been much better than the United States in this. For example, gasoline taxes are much higher in Europe typically than they are in the United States.
Yeah, we know.
They are, yes, and that's probably a good thing, and that affects how much you drive. It affects what kind of cars you drive. So it affects all sorts of decisions. And so that I think that is a step in the right direction. It's politically very unpopular, and so that's why we haven't seen really any politician here embrace that. Donald Trump, I have it on good authority, does not believe in climate change. I talked to somebody who worked in his first administration who said he thinks climate change is a hoax. I'm not enough of a scientist to convince him otherwise, but I tend to believe scientists. So when the majority of scientists tell me it's real, I'm inclined to say they must be right. And so I take climate change seriously. And I think economics can provide one of the solutions. And I think putting a price on carbon is one of them. Other things, of course, involve things like technological change and facilitating research into new, cleaner forms of energy, which is happening already. Not only wind and solar, which we have, but I have a friend who's a venture capitalist, and one of the big investments that he's made in his venture capital firm is in fusion energy, and he believes that within my lifetime, we're going to see much electricity produced with fusion, which is a very clean and very effective form of energy production. It's to me, it sounds a little pie in the sky, but what do I know about technology? I mean, clearly fusion produces a lot of energy. Of course, it's going to be harnessed to make it a productive form of producing energy, so we actually turn it into electricity. There's a group actually that's called Commonwealth Fusion. I think there's other groups doing this too, but he's invested in a group called Commonwealth Fusion, which is basically a bunch of MIT professors, engineering professors, who are involved in this project to try to harness fusion energy for electricity production. They're starting up, I think, to build a plant soon in Virginia. So this thing is moving ahead. And, so it could well be that a lot of these climate issues that we're talking about are going to look very different once we figure out ways to produce large amounts of energy in a relatively carbon efficient way.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, you said it yourself in the principles that markets are usually a good way to organize economics. But is this a problem with carbon tax something that should where market actually really mess it up, and you need to step in with these measures?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we one of the big theme of microeconomics is when do markets work and when do markets not work? What is market success? What is market failures? And some people look at economics and say, oh, it's really very conservative because it talks about the wonders of Adam Smith's invisible hand and how markets can work, and it glorifies greed, saying greed can be harnessed to make the world a better place. But that's only the first part of micros, talk about the successes of markets. The second part is saying, well, when do markets not work? And one of the big cases where markets do not work, which is in fact the first example of market failure that I emphasize in the principles book, is externalities. That is when a market activity has impacts on third parties, on bystanders. The buyers and sellers interact through supply and demand and are affected by market prices. But when those decisions can under certain circumstances be optimal, but if those decisions affect bystanders that aren't being taken into account, then those third parties could be potentially harmed, in some cases helped, and the market's not necessarily going to reach an efficient outcome. And pollution is the classic example of that. Mm-hmm. And it's why that all economists say that the government needs to get involved when there's a pollution that's affecting large numbers of people. And the biggest example of that in the modern economy today is climate change, because the climate change is literally a global problem. So when I drive and release carbon in the atmosphere, I'm adversely affecting all 8 billion people on Earth by contributing a little bit to climate change, and I'm not taking that into account. Whereas if I put a tax on my carbon emissions, then I'll be indirectly taking that effect into account.
Yeah. I'm just thinking a little bit logically here. How do you measure the efficiency of the carbon tax? Is it measured as the regular tax? Because if amount of the carbon tax is increasing from year to year to year, does it implies that people just simply don't care about the carbon tax and are willing to increase their carbon emissions? Or is it measured by how much of the money from the carbon tax goes into regulating these carbon emissions? How they think?
I mean, you raise a very important question: is how big should the carbon tax be? And the theory gives you a precise answer, but implementing that precise answer is difficult. And the precise answer is the size of the carbon tax should equal the cost of the external cost of the carbon emissions. That is, how much does a unit of carbon released into the atmosphere, how much does that affect third parties in dollar terms? And that's the amount the carbon tax should be. Now that's relatively precise. The problem that what's not precise is how to estimate that. How big is the effect of carbon on third parties? And that is a thing that economists in this climate literature have debated. The two prominent economists that I talk about when I lecture on this to my students is Bill Nordhaus at Yale, who won the Nobel Prize for his work on climate change, and Nicholas Stern, who produced a very important report for the British government on climate. And they came up with very different numbers in terms of how big. I think their numbers are a factor of 10 apart. So they have very different answers to the question of the carbon tax. They both agree it shouldn't be zero, which is what it is now. So they both agree to increasing it from where we are, but how much to increase it is, I think, a matter of debate. And reasonable people can disagree. One of the reasons it's so difficult to know is the effects of climate change are so far in the future. I mean, there's some effects today for sure, but the biggest effects are in the very distant future. And trying to figure out, okay, how much should we pay today to avoid those effects in the distant future is a very hard question. Some pollution is more immediate. Like, you talk about smog, well, you can figure out, well, smog enters the atmosphere, more people get sick, and you talk about the cost of sickness and so on. But that's like immediate. But climate change is a generational problem, and therefore the estimates are necessarily going to be precise. My own response to that is, oh yes, therefore we should start putting on a carbon tax, and we'll figure it out as we go along how big it should be. But even though we're starting at zero, I know we know which direction it should go from zero.
Yeah. But I think there is also, from what I get from from the internet and talking to people, in regards to this, you're talking now of carbon tax, and you mentioned you driving your car on almost individual level how much we influence climate change, and I think somewhere in discussion a lot of people especially in Europe, because they are very much environmentally conscious, especially in European Union, a lot of people ride bikes and electric cars and are not polluting and similar recycle, and still a lot of policies sort of aim towards climate change. But some of these people are now saying that some of the biggest polluters are not doing their job, sort of, because now I'm on individual level, I'm doing my work, but there are countries like Saudi Arabia, China, Russia, who are United States even, who do the biggest amount of work, and it kind of does a harm a little bit on the the whole idea of it. Do you find that a little bit damaging maybe to this discussion of it?
Yes, absolutely. I think you're pointing out what's, I think, one of the hardest political issues, which is that climate change is global, and therefore any solution has to be global. And it doesn't matter from the standpoint of the atmosphere whether a unit of carbon is released in Europe or released in China. It enters the atmosphere and has the same impact. So the ideal policy would be to put a global carbon tax being done implemented country by country, and so therefore the revenues are collected country by country. But ideally, every country should put on the same price of carbon. That would be the efficient way of reducing carbon emissions globally. That requires a degree of international cooperation that is often hard to achieve. We have international organizations that are aiming for for international cooperation, for things like the United Nations. But my sense is they're not all that effective.
No kidding.
Yeah, exactly. So sometimes they are. I mean, the WTO, until Trump decided to ignore it, that was a reasonably effective, I think, as an organization. So I don't think it's necessarily the case that international organizations are useless, but politics is difficult. I mean, even when economics is easy for an issue, the politics it can be difficult. And ultimately, the economists don't get to set policy; they get to analyze policy, they get to suggest policy. But ultimately, it's the political leaders who set policy, and the political leaders are often, especially in democracies for sure, are beholden to their voters. And so the issue is to convince the voters to put pressure on their political leaders. And of course, non-democracies, it's just the political leaders deciding on their own what to do. But those are very difficult political issues. And so we need to really convince large numbers of people of the rightness of the economic thinking. This gets back to why I love reaching so many people with my economics textbook. I hope that by selling millions of copies of my book around the world, that I convince a few people that the economist's way of looking at these problems is right, and that helps facilitate more rational economic policy solutions. Because ultimately, if you can convince every economist, but if you're only convincing the economists, you're not getting anywhere. You've really got to convince the much broader public of the economic way of thinking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm going to jump a little bit on the other theme, and that is inflation. And now, basically speaking, how do you explain inflation to someone who just thinks prices are going crazy? How would you approach it?
Well, I think ultimately it boils down to monetary policy. And one of my 10 principles of economics is that we have inflation when the government creates too much money. And that's clearest in cases of very high inflation. When you go to Germany in the 1920s or Zimbabwe a few years ago, you look at any sort of very high inflation country, it all has to do with monetary policy. And usually it has to do with monetary policy that is out of control, in part because they are under pressure from the fiscal authority to print money to cover budget deficits. So I think we understand high inflation when it occurs. It's not always easy to solve the problem, in part because in these high inflation economies, you have to first create an independent central bank that's going to resist pressure from the fiscal authority to print money when they want them to. And you've already seen this in the United States, where Donald Trump has been putting pressure on the central bank to pursue more expansionary policy. But fortunately, it's not happened yet. But in other countries where it has happened, we know what happens. High inflation is the result. So ultimately, it has to do with understanding central banking. Central banking seems very mysterious to a lot of people, and I understand that until you've studied economics, you probably have no idea what a central bank is. But ultimately, it's just that it's basically it's the institution that we create to oversee the currency and the monetary system of the banking system. It's not just another bank. It's a sort of special different kind of institution. And especially in a system of fiat money, which we have, money's not backed by any commodity. It really is. It's a really very important institution that needs to be independent, needs to be well run, in order to keep inflation at manageable levels.
Yeah, you mentioned a couple of examples about inflation and everything. How much are you familiar, and I believe you are, about the hyperinflation in ex-Yugoslavia in 90s?
Well, I don't know the details. But I will bet that if you had hyperinflation, you had lots of money creation. Yeah, right. I mean, it happen every time. Very high inflation, it comes down to money creation, and usually it comes down to a central bank that is focused on things other than price stability. One thing we've come to see over the years is that central banks need to have price stability as either their main focus or one of their main focuses. And like the European Central Bank has inflation stability as the the main focus. The U.S. central bank has a dual mandate, just maximum sustainable employment and price stability. But I think it's plausible to say that they focus first and foremost on price stability. Because they really can't get a full functioning economy if prices are out of control. And you see this, you saw the central bank make a mistake in the United States in 2022, post-pandemic, when inflation got up to about 10%. And they quickly reacted, trying to reverse course. And they clearly made a mistake during the pandemic. And after that, they recognized the mistake and tried to get back to price stability, or pretty close to that now. I mean, inflation in the United States now is, I don't know, 2.5. It may go up a little bit because of these tariffs that President Trump is putting on, but it's clear that the Fed is focused on that and is not going to let is going to do everything they can to try to avoid getting inflation back up to the 10% range we saw just 3 years ago.
Yeah, if you find some time to look into this matter about the inflation in Yugoslavia that I mentioned, it's a good scenario. It's a good case for the stabilization program that was introduced back then by Abramovich and his team, because inflation in Yugoslavia went for 25 months, and the peak month daily inflation was around 60%, right?
Yeah.
So that spearheaded into 330 million percent of inflation. So, and in span of 3 months, he introduced the stabilization program, completely cut off of the government, and it brought down, deflation in March of around 6%. So it's a good case to study. So maybe when you have some time, look about it.
Maybe a good case study for my next edition of the textbook.
Yeah. And it's a good, historically, it's a good place where you see politics, dunking the economy, if you will.
Yeah.
What happened is, even we have it even, some old coins and similar, and money which reached 500 trillion dollar bill. If you want trillion, not dollar.
He removed
dinner bill.
in redenominations or 15 zeros from the currency. So that's a lot of work.
Yes. No, I mean, that's a very common story in stories of hyperinflation. So I think it's something we economists understand, but that doesn't stop politicians from thinking that they can avoid it, or maybe they're just very short-sighted, and then when they're putting pressure on the central bank to print money, maybe they realize that what's going to happen in the long run, but they're focused too much on the short run.
Yeah.
The long run's not that far. I mean, it doesn't take very long. If you start printing out huge amounts of money, within a year or two, you're up at that higher inflation range. So they have to be very short run focused. So you'd start using the monetary printing press to deal with shortfalls in the fiscal situation.
Yeah. And there's a lot of debate in the media, particularly about the Phillips curve, especially after the COVID pandemics and everything happening. And the theory is a little bit challenged itself. So do you think that Phillips curves is still useful in today's economy, or should somehow that idea be retired? What's your take?
I think it depends on what you mean by the Phillips curve. I think if one means, there's a simple, stable relationship between inflation and unemployment, then no, then that should be retired. That doesn't exist. If you think that in the short run, certain policies, in particular monetary policy, pushes inflation and unemployment in opposite directions, that means that you face a short-run Phillips curve, even if that short-run Phillips curve is going to be different a year from now or a year ago. And because we understand now that all sorts of things can shift that short-run Phillips curve. One of them is supply shocks, change in the world oil market, for example, or changes in inflation expectations can shift the Phillips curve. So I think the Phillips curve is useful as a conceptual tool based on the knowledge that inflation and unemployment are pushed in opposite directions through aggregate demand policies like monetary policy. But if you expect to look at the data and say, there's a simple, reliable, stable, downward sloping relationship, then no, that's not there. That's long gone.
Yeah. Do you think maybe, at least my one of my professors said it, that inflation is one of the most important economics concept for the common citizens to understand. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, people use money as a store of value, and I mean, a lot of people have their wealth tied up in some asset denominated in the domestic currency, and so when there's inflation, it's basically a form of default on their assets. So if you're holding a government bond, you're expecting a certain return on that government bond. If you get the return, but then the price level rises by a factor of 10, well, then the real return, your purchasing power has vanished, even if you're getting paid. So so inflation is really a secret form of default on government liabilities, since most of those government liabilities are denominated in the domestic currency in most cases.
So, what's one economic myth that drives you nuts every time that you hear it repeated in media or politics or in this episode?
I haven't heard you guys to repeat any myths. Good job. What kind of myths do I hear? I think the myth I hear most common now gets back to our earlier discussion of trade and this idea that Americans are losers in this global trade war. I mean, Donald Trump basically got elected president for putting forward that myth repeatedly and convincing people that it was true and that he had a solution to it. And I think he was basically wrong. I believe strongly in the principle of comparative advantage, going back to David Ricardo, the idea that when countries import and export based on what they're best at, that prosperity rises both at home and abroad, and that trade impediments like tariffs or trade or quotas or other trade restrictions are harmful to both countries at home and abroad. And so we shouldn't think of trade as a zero sum. And my colleague Stephanie Stencheva, a brilliant young economist at Harvard, has done a lot of work recently on zero sum thinking, and this idea that there's a fixed economic pie, and if one person's getting a bigger slice, I must be getting a smaller slice as a result. And I think that's extremely dangerous form of thinking about trade policy, but really about economic policy in any context. That really what economics is about is trying to figure out ways to expand the economic pie, whether it's through trade or advances in technology, and our good policy is trying to figure out ways to expand the pie. And to the extent you were worried that some people's slices are too small, trying to figure out the most efficient ways to reslice the pie in a way that doesn't shrink the pie substantially. So economists are not always opposed to redistribution, but they don't want inefficient redistribution. So something like rent control is a way to help the poor that's not particularly well targeted and is tremendously inefficient. Whereas things like an earned income tax credit or universal basic income or something like that is ways to help people without shrinking the pie too much. And so what economists basically want to do is say, well, let's have as big a pie as we can, and when we want to redistribute the slices, let's do it as efficiently as we can, so we don't have as big a cost in terms of shrinking the pie. That's really what economics is all about.
I got reminded, when you spoke about trade and tariffs, obviously, one of the things that Trump, referenced a lot of time is and I don't know if you looked into that, is presidency of William McKinley, and how, well, that's what he said, that he put a lot of tariffs and that, United States got so rich on it. I know nothing about William McKinley except that he got assassinated and that, then Theodore Roosevelt got the reins. And did you look into that? Is there what's the story behind that?
I don't. I have not studied the McKinley administration in detail. My understanding is that he did put some tariffs on, but then he eventually backtracked on that. And similarly, Trump has put on some tariffs and then backtracks. He's constantly he's all over the place on tariffs. But I do think that the United States grew tremendously back that part of our history. But I don't think it was primarily due to tariffs. I think it's primarily due to the Industrial Revolution and the growth and the entrepreneurs of their day. We talk about people today like Elon Musk and Steve Jobs as sort of providing technological innovations that are the forces of economic growth today. But if you go back to them, we had innovations that were vastly more important. I'm sitting here in Nantucket, actually. Where I have my vacation home. And Nantucket was originally famous for whaling. And whaling was a tremendously important industry because we needed whale oil for things like lamps. For things like whale oil, people would be sitting in the dark all the time. And even the light they had at night wasn't very good because whale oil lamps were not that effective. And eventually whaling went out. It disappeared as an industry for a couple of reasons. One is the whale population started declining, making it harder and harder to catch whales. But the second thing is we had entrepreneurs like John D. Rockefeller, who said, this stuff that's coming, this black stuff coming out of the ground, we can turn that into kerosene. So long before it was gasoline, it was kerosene, and kerosene provided a way to light your lamps, and we didn't need whale oil. And there's a wonderful study by Bill Nordhaus about the price of light. And if you think about it, think about our lives, light is pretty important, right? If you had to sit in the dark whenever the sun was down, your life would be a lot worse off. So being able to light your house is really pretty darn important. And the price of a unit of light, I guess a lumen is called, the price of a lumen has come down over history tremendously. And because, early on, it was like we had to go catch whales, and then it became kerosene. And now we have electricity produced with wind and solar, and in a few years of maybe it'll be common law fusion producing electricity even cheaper. And so we can light our houses. And that's really a tremendous advance. Some people have looked across countries and used how much light comes out of the country as a measure of economic prosperity. These countries that are poor tend not to have a lot of good energy and tend to sit in the dark a lot. So, like if you look up from satellites, the difference between North Korea and South Korea, North Korea sits there in the dark at night, and South Korea is lit up because it's a prosperous economy. And I think that if you go back again, this is going back to McKinley. If you go back to 150 years ago, the advances we had were largely due to entrepreneurs figuring out ways to produce goods cheaply. So people like John Rockefeller are viewed as one of the robber barons today, but they were part of this energy revolution that occurred. Similarly, think of Henry Ford. Figure out how we could make cars cheaply, so that everybody could afford one. Or Carnegie, or Mellon, all these guys were really tremendously. We think of them as robber barons, getting vastly rich and often spending it in conspicuous ways. But they were also part of a really robust period of economic growth that called the Industrial Revolution, that increased the quality of life tremendously over those years.
Yeah, well, you would agree that John D. Rockefeller later wasn't so fond of any competition, right?
Well, we need antitrust laws, and we need to be smart about applying them. So I'm not opposed to antitrust policy, but I really do believe John D. Rockefeller did more good than harm in his life. I mean, first of all, I think the whole creation of the oil industry was tremendously important, and then look at what he did with his money afterwards. He created University of Chicago. He didn't even name it after himself. He created Rockefeller University in New York. I created the Rockefeller Foundation. So I actually think if you look at the life of John D. Rockefeller, I think it was a plus rather than a minus. Similarly, I think Elon Musk. That's some things I'm not particularly fond of. I haven't particularly been fond of his downsizing initiative in the federal government. I don't think he was a particular expert on government organization. So I haven't been fond of his work there. But the energy initiatives he's had, whether it's things like Tesla or SpaceX, he and his fellow entrepreneurs who've got fabulously wealthy. They've usually done it by creating goods that we all value. And think of Steve Jobs, who became one of the richest people alive. He carries we all carry around these now. Everybody all over the world carry these. And it's all because Steve Jobs had the idea that you could stick a computer and a phone and a camera and literally everything else you want to do in a teeny little box I can stick in my pocket. And sure, Steve Jobs got incredibly rich doing it, but he made all of our lives vastly better at the same time.
Yeah, we are speaking about all forms of the energy utilization. So maybe if Adam Smith was alive today, wealth of nations would be measured by that. So, so what's something that you have changed your mind about over the years in economics? Is there something that you would point out more than anything else?
Well, and there's some detail things. My overall view of the world hasn't changed. And I took my own introductory economics course from two fantastic economists, Harvey Rosen and Bert Malkiel, microeconomics from Harvey Rosen and macroeconomics from Bert Malkiel. And I think most of what they taught me, I still agree with. There's small details of things that I changed my mind on. So if you'd asked me 20 years ago, what's the best rate of inflation for a country to pursue, I would have said 0. And so I didn't see any real particularly benefits to inflation. Now, having suffered through periods of the zero lower bound on interest rates, I think the Fed and other central banks are right that probably 2 is a better number than 0. And maybe you can even convince me of 3 or 4. I think a small degree of inflation is probably better just because you don't deal with the problem of zero lower bound of monetary policy. I don't think it's a huge revision, but it's for a monetary economist, that's a pretty big change. That's probably the biggest single economic issue I've changed my mind on. On issues of political philosophy, I'm probably less of a utilitarian than I used to be. If you had asked me when I was in college and after that, I probably would have said, I'm pretty much a utilitarian. I was I thought of myself as following in the footsteps of John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham. I think now I've probably moved slightly in the direction of more libertarian political philosophy, away from utilitarian. But I can see sort of the merits in both. And my personal political philosophy is probably an uncomfortable amalgam of different political philosophies rather than believing in any one pure form.
Yeah. Libertarians would love your carbon tax at all.
Well, no, the hardcore libertarians, with me, like the Libertarian Party in the United States, I view as much too extreme.
But there are always levels, Some people would look at you and someone like Milton Friedman as, a market fundamentalist. But then you have Ludwig von Mises. But then you have someone like Murray Rothbard. So yeah,
exactly. Ayn Rand apparently once said that she thought Milton was a socialist, which Milton thought was very funny. So I'm probably closer to Milton Friedman. Even Milton at times strikes me as a little too libertarian. So there's certain things that he might not agree with, like some regulations. Like, how do you feel about government meat inspectors, food inspectors? I'm perfectly fine with that. The hardcore libertarians say, well, the market should do that, and they should have private inspection agencies, and so. But I'm not opposed to sort of government involved in basic regulations. Partly because I've been persuaded by the behavioral economists. This actually gets back to things changing my mind on. Behavioral economics as a field didn't exist when I was a student. So I really bought into the people are rational, that's the right model of human behavior. And I was a very neoclassical economist. And if you look at the first edition of my principles book, it didn't have any behavioral economics in it at all. Subsequent editions have incorporated behavioral economics. And I've gotten persuaded by the behavioral economists that, yes, there are some important deviations from rationality. I'm nervous about the government taking advantage of those because I don't think people in government are rational, whereas private consumers are irrational. So to the extent as the irrationality, it pervades all aspects of life, not just the market. But I think life is messier than I thought it was. I think behavioral economics convinces you that people in all spheres can deviate from rationality, sometimes systematically, and that makes for economic reform, trying to come up with good economic policy, all the more difficult.
Yeah. Well, final issue for me. We did an episode on this podcast. We called it "History of American Decline." Sort of going through the Americans obsessed with declining empire sort of feeling, even since the beginning. Jefferson believing it will ultimately fail as a project. Then Civil War, then oil embargo. To this day, people are speaking about it. And one of the, on the side of economics at least, issues that's always talked about, but it seems it will never get tackled, in practice, is debt. Now, when you're just a regular person, people tell you should be in debt. That's not good, you know. But then you enter the class of economics, and you find out some of the most prosperous countries that you wanted to live in your entire life are some of the most in debt countries, like Japan, United States, obviously, and similar. So it's always a topic about the U.S., especially the debt, growing debt crisis. Do you think it will be the doom of the United States, the death?
I'm more optimistic than that. I do think we're on an unsustainable trajectory. If you look at the debt to GDP ratio projected by the Congressional Budget Office, it's basically rising without end, and that can't go on forever. How long it can go on is hard to know. At some point, one of two things are going to happen. Either we're wake up and some president's going to level with the American people, explain that we're on a sustainable path, and then implement some policies that will be painful in the short run, but beneficial in the long run. Or we'll keep going along this path blithely as if nothing is a problem. And then at some point, the bond market will wake up and say, my God, these guys aren't serious. And you'll see some sort of a crisis in the way they saw with Greece a few years ago, or Argentina, or other countries that have run into serious debt crises. I fear the latter because that's the far more painful way to deal with it. But I'm hopeful of the former. But either one of those two scenarios will lead us to have to implement policies that put us on a sustainable path, which we're not on now. If I had to predict what we'll end up doing, even though there's no political support for it now, is I think we will eventually have a value-added tax, because I think Americans want enough government that we can't really do it just by cutting spending, despite what some libertarian policymakers want. And so I think we're going to have to increase revenue. I think the most efficient way to raise revenue is with a value-added tax. I mean, a lot of European countries have it, as you know, and it is it's a relatively efficient way to raise a fair amount of revenue. And I suspect that the United States will regress towards the mean. The mean country on the world has a value-added tax. I think we will eventually get there, not soon, but eventually.
Just go to 21% like we do.
Yeah, so I don't think we need to go that high. No, we don't need a 21% VAT.
Yeah, it got so dark so fast.
Well, it was 15 when I was a kid. Not just one.
The opponents of that worry that once we put it on, it'll be too easy to raise, and that's why they don't want to start down that route. And I understand that concern, and I had more sympathy for it if they had an alternative policy in mind to try to put us on a sustainable path. But usually they don't, and that's why I think that it was probably the most likely outcome.
So before we wrap up, we have a little tradition where we have a quote from one of the intellectuals here from Montenegro, or from the Yugoslavian region, and translate it from Montenegrin to English to transfer a little bit of culture. So Luka prepared a quote for this episode.
Yeah, I prepared a quote from Nobel Prize winner Ivo Andrić, writer, and in our language he said, čudno je kako je malo potrebno da budemo sretni. Još čudnije kako nam često baš to malo nedostaje. And in English it would translate to, it's strange how little is needed to be happy, and even more strange how often we lack just that little bit.
It's a great quote.
Yeah.
Professor, I hope you were captivated in this during this hour with us and interested in that you had a good time, basically.
It was a pleasure. Thank you, gentlemen.